everyone. Welcome to episode 2 of Holy Ourselves, a podcast about becoming more authentic in our faith, especially in our relationship with our sexuality and our gender. No pretending, no fixing, just figuring out what it means to be whole before God, others, and ourselves in the midst of this crazy world. My name is Josh, and I am excited to be on this journey. This is going to be another adventure of just me sharing with you guys. As I said last time, this is a new thing for me. It's not something I've done a lot in my I guess a little bit when you do like narration, but it's not something I've done a ton. But I'm excited to be on a new journey and kind of get out of my comfort zone in a lot of different ways. So I explained last episode a lot of the why behind this podcast. So if you haven't listened to that, I would really recommend going back and listening to it, because there's going to be so much of really confronting the ways that we have been given sexuality, especially within the church, especially within the Christian, paradigm and framework. And honestly, in many ways, how it actually doesn't line up with what our faith gives us around sexuality. We often are so focused on behaving correctly, and that's a good thing. We need to behave correctly. We need to have proper ethics and morals and then live that out. But I think if we just stop there, we miss such a critical part of really actually what is happening in our sexuality. And my desire for this podcast, which again, I said last episode, and go back and listen to it, it's going to be really foundational. My desire for this podcast is to meet us all on the journey where we're at. So I hope that you can be able to receive something here as we go forward. Before we get into the topic and everything, I do need to acknowledge I took a trip last week over to the West Coast. So I live on the East Coast of the United States and traveled all the way over to the West Coast, basically as far as you can get. I'm in Florida, and I went up to the northern section of the country, and gosh, am I still recovering. I feel like, when I was in my early 20s, I could get off a plane after a trip, jump right in with friends, go out, have fun. I truly believe every year it takes me about 4.5 more hours to recover from a trip than it did before, especially a trip where you're going as far as all of this. But, and if you want to calculate, about 24, 25 is when it basically took me no time. I feel like now it takes me 48 hours in order to recover. So you can do the math if you want to. But over a decade, it has been insane how much longer it takes me. And so I'm still recovering, but I wanted to get another episode out. I do want to try and make this a bi-weekly podcast. And they're not all going to just be me talking. But like I said, there's some things that I feel, in previous podcasts and Life on Side B and all of that, I was really interviewing because I was so new, and I'm still learning, obviously, but I really didn't know a lot. And so I wanted to talk to people. I was learning. A lot of that podcast was I had questions I wanted to ask people, and I thought, well, if I'm going to ask, there's probably someone else who wants to know about this. So why not have other people? And I think what's the difference now is I've grown a lot. I kind of work in this area of sexuality and faith. And so I'm like, well, I do have things to share. So let's start there. But even next episode, which I'll share a little bit more about later, is actually going to be an interview. So last episode, introduced the podcast and then also talked a little bit about wholeness. Ultimately, this podcast is called Holy Ourselves. So what do we mean by wholeness? So we went a little bit, didn't have as much time as I would have liked to, just because I'm trying to keep these episodes around 30 minutes. But in general, went around what does this idea of wholeness mean? Today, I really want to focus in on the idea of what is sexuality? Like when we use this term, what are we talking about? And I think we so often do not understand it correctly. And I would love to invite you to think when you hear the word sexuality, like what comes to mind? I think for most of us, we automatically go to what I do in the bedroom or what I don't do in the bedroom and or what I want to do in the bedroom, all of the different things, all focused on the bedroom and the lack thereof. But I think that when we really grasp and really seek to understand sexuality, we find it so much bigger. Like it is about desire, it's about connection, it's about how we relate to the world, how we relate to our bodies, how we relate to how we understand our own identity. I think it's not even, again, I'm really trying to not use that. I think it's the reality of what sexuality is. And so going into the misunderstanding, as I said before, when you hear the word sexuality, what do you think of? Most likely there's going to be this connotation of sexuality equals behavior. And that's so common in our culture. That's really common in the church. But that's what we think about. We think about behavior. We might think about our desire for sex, but it's really focused in on the act of sex and the desire for sex. And I think that really even becomes more prominent with queer people, which we'll talk about in a moment. But beyond the focus on sex, beyond the focus on desire for sex and sexual connection, we're often limited into these understandings of once you get to that understanding of sex, it's either about repressing it or expressing it. And those are the two options. It's never really about how do you integrate that into who you are as a person and your understanding of being human. So when we look at then focusing in, I think this is where the whole culture is caught up in this understanding. But then when you hone in even more into the Christian culture, we really focus in on the morality of everything, right and wrong behavior, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. And then focusing in on that focus of sexual behavior, this is where I think we get caught up in so many ways, especially around queer people. So I want to talk about this for a moment. This is not necessarily a political podcast, but I do think that we can't really talk about sexuality without getting into politics because there's a lot actually about sexuality in our politics. And I think one area that is really high, that this kind of misinterpretation of sexuality is highlighted is in areas like talking about topics around school. And even when we're talking about kids, when we talk about, for instance, the LGBT topics within sexuality, on LGBT topics in sexuality within school, there's often a lot of these cases that have gone before judges, before even the Supreme Court, about whether it is appropriate for LGBT topics to be at different stages, even as far as young as elementary school. Now, granted, there's a lot more complexity to that about whether parents have rights to have their kids there. But I want to focus in on a lot of it then comes down to, do you think it's appropriate for these topics to be taught? That's kind of what we're getting at in a lot of these cultural discussions. And what I think is interesting is the moment we jump into these conversations, regardless of what your view is on it, we often are, when we have hesitation, it's because we are connotating LGBT topics with talking about sex. And the reality is, when we actually understand that sexuality is much broader, sexuality envelops a lot of who we are, how we engage in the world, our bodies, and these things. It is so much more complex than that. And actually, there's a lot of things that our kids engage in and kids talk about and see that are sexuality. We just don't connotate it in that way. When a Disney movie is highlighting a princess and her relationship with a prince, that is sexuality. We just don't see it as that because it's not about the act of sex. And so then when we get onto LGBT topics, this is really where the narrow version and the narrow definition of sexuality really harms queer people a lot, because we automatically connotate queer people with sex. This even comes into play when queer people come out to their loved ones, when they share about their attractions, their identity. A lot of times family members with hesitations will be like, well, why do I need to know about your sex life? Well, the reality is it's a lot more than sex life. It's about how I see the world. It's about how I interact with the world. It's about how the world interacts with me. You know, queer people want to invite their loved ones into understanding them better. But the hard part is we automatically think sexuality equals sex. Queer people, queer identity focuses around sexual attraction. Therefore, all of it is enveloped in sex. And this is so detrimental to it. It really kind of moralizes in many ways the queer existence, regardless of behavior, regardless of your theology on sexual behavior or any of these things. It it creates a moral framework from even seeing the identity of people and how they experience the world. I think on the flip side of that, the other sad part of this narrow definition of sexuality is that often straight people do not realize how much of their lives is focused in around sexuality. Because when you have queer people talking about their identity, it can often feel from straight people like, why are you talking about this so much? Well, the reality is you're talking about it just as much. It's just called your spouse, it's called your family, it's called, all of these different things. And the amount of our identity and our lives that are focused in on that. I mean, we've all been there. The moment someone has kids, you just realize like that's going to be their entire talking point for the next however many years because their kids envelop their lives, their spouse envelops their lives. It takes a while for that not to be your sole focus. So, but we don't think of that as a sexuality conversation, which I think is really fascinating. Often it's seen as something larger, but reality is I don't think that is true. And I think we all get harmed in this. Again, not I think. We all get harmed in this. That is the reality because you have queer people being reduced to what they want to do in a bedroom, what they desire to do with other people sexually. That becomes the sole understanding of what their identity is wrapped around when because of it's not even because of their identity, it's because of our misunderstanding. And then I think that, gosh, y'all, we're going to make this a whole thing on this podcast. I'm going to use I think when I actually just think something, but there are a lot of times some of these things that I'm saying are just reality. And in this case, sexuality, the narrow definition of sexuality, is so harmful, I think, to straight people because that narrow definition of sexuality does not allow us to actually really embody our sexuality, to actually really feel at home in our bodies, to be at home in our desires, to really accept the craziness of what we desire because we shut it down, we push it away, and we don't deal with it. So in the reality, this may seem like such a nuanced thing. Why am I talking about this for a whole entire episode? Well, there's important reasons because I believe that until we can have this base understanding, we can't really get anywhere. And it's going to be foundational for basically anything we talk about. So if sexuality is more than sex, more than your desire for sex, what is it? I've kind of hinted to it, but to give a clear understanding, I would define sexuality as a core part of being human. It is the relational part of being human, of our understanding of ourselves and how we relate to other people. It involves our body image, our self image. It involves our thoughts, our feelings, kind of that's where our attractions come into play. It involves our socialization. This is really, really important. This is a part that we really, really miss a lot. Sometimes we can understand, okay, self-image, my identity as a man or a woman, that obviously comes into play. My thoughts, my feelings, okay, sexual attraction, that comes into play. We often will get that. That's not necessarily surprising. I think where we really get surprised often is in this area of socialization, is our social groups, our non-sexual encounters, especially with people that are maybe not intimate relationships in our lives. That is still an act of sexuality. And I'll talk a little bit about how all of these play together, but I'm going to go through that. So we have our body, our self-image, thoughts and feelings, our socialization, the different wheels of the different circles of areas that we interact with the world. Then we also have our values and our beliefs. This is where our ethics come into play, our maybe our faith, our morals, those areas come into play really, really big. And then obviously our relationships. This includes intimacy, interpersonal commitments, and then sexual activity. But it is important to understand when I talk about relationships in sexuality, that does not simply involve people that you are having sex with or want to have sex with. Let's be real. It also involves your friendships. It also involves your family. These are relationships that involve our sexuality. So how does that relate? And there's often, you might be able to look at it. Sometimes people will call this the sexuality wheel. So you have body, self-image, thoughts and feelings, socialization, beliefs and values, relationships. I think I got everything there. Yeah. These areas all interact with each other. How I see myself as a man or as a woman or as a non-binary or wherever else on the spectrum of identity affects how I relate with other people. The fact that I identify that I am a man and I identify as a man changes the way I interact with women, the way I interact with other men, even then going down the way my identity as a gay man actually changes how I interact with people. My view of my own body changes how I interact with people. These things really, really make a difference. They shift the way that we interact and in ways more than what we know. Because if you hear a lot of this, you, especially with female experiences of when there was the whole thing going on about, the bear or the man, which one do you choose? I think one of the biggest things, obviously, in that has been the fear of harm, but that plays into the reality of being a woman fearing male interactions. Gender plays a part in this. And so we need to understand that just the simple identification is not just, our gender and our identity, even then into sexuality. It's not just a thing in and of itself. It changes how we relate to other people and how we relate even to our own values. And then therefore, rooted out of that self-image, rooted out of all of those things, then comes even our values and how we act in the world and in our relationships. So then why is this important? I think when we open up our understanding of sexuality, we find that we are literally living out our sexuality at all times. You may be celibate. You may just not be sexually active, but not for any committed reason. You're still living out your sexuality on a daily basis. And that is the shift that happens when I am going out in public. I am engaging in sexuality. When I'm hanging out with my friends, I am engaging in sexuality. I am living out my sexuality, maybe more than engaging. But these different aspects allow us the awareness of these things, then allows us to notice how my desires are coming into play, how my social circles are coming into play, how my values and my morals are coming into play, my faith. And then when we get into that faith, a lot of these things come together. So with our gender and our embodiment, I really don't like the language of I have a body, or my body and these things. Within the Christian faith, we have lost a lot of the importance of the body from our Greek and really Gnostic influence that has happened over the last, 1,000 years. Um, we have lacked the importance of the body. We've gotten this idea that I'm going to die and I'm going to go away and I'm going to be a ghost and never have a body again. But the reality is Christian faith, Christian creed, Christian belief is based on the importance and the value and the dignity of the body. This is why Jesus's bodily resurrection is so important. And it carries within it our understanding of the image of God, because even going all the way back to Genesis 1. There is an understanding that there's a relationship with how we relate to each other, not just in gender, but as people, that encompasses the image of God. The image of God is a whole point in a conversation. But I think it is important then from that flows even our desires. It is, and within our desires, this is the connection point of our desires and our values. We have to broaden our understanding of engaging with our desires than more than just, is this a good desire or is this a bad desire? Do I need to repress this or can I express this? That kind of paradigm. It's still an important framework, but we cannot just stop there. We have to be able to allow curiosity to understand our desires, to understand what drives me. Why am I being pulled in this way? What am I desiring really at its base? Because then this lays into our relationships. I think, no, I'll say I think here because I don't know if I have the statistical work to say this, but I know I know multiple authors have said it, but I do think that sex and our desire for sex is one of our greatest languages of communicating our needs and our fears and our desires. Often when we're desiring something, even go down to that baseline understanding of desiring sex, desiring someone sexually, desiring something sexually, connection in these things, it speaks often to much deeper uh, needs, deeper fears, deeper longings than just the desire to have sex with someone. And then getting even lower in this, the broadening of this sexuality definition actually impacts how we engage with God. One of You'll never be able to unsee it. And this is going to get into a little bit of what I'm going to be talking about on the Patreon episodes, which I'll talk about in a moment, a little bit more in a moment, but in a little bit. When we can broaden our understanding of sexuality to this larger vision, we see how much sexuality actually plays out in scripture. It's everywhere. And it's not just in the relationships of people, but also our relationship with God. God's relationship with humanity is envisioned in an intimate, romantic, even sexual relationship, which feels very weird for us at times, depending on your background, depending on your feelings around sex and a lot of these kinds of things. But the reality is, marital relationships, sexual relationships are used uh, in scripture to connotate and express our relationship with God. And so when we can have a deeper understanding of how this whole image, this wheel of sexuality works, we can actually deepen our relationship with God. I believe that at my very, very core. And I think another thing that comes out of this, well, I guess I said it before, but to say it again, another core piece that comes out of this sexuality conversation, this broadening of the definition, is that it helps us understand it does not matter if you're having sex. It doesn't matter if you aren't having sex or wherever you are in that journey, you are still living out sexuality. It is still a part of your life. So I hope that this can be helpful. Again, you may leave this going, cool, nothing new for me. And that's great. I love that you already have this paradigm. And maybe what I would encourage is if this has just seemed kind of nominal and bland to you, like there's not really a lot here. Again, I could go and talk about this forever, but I'm trying to keep these more shorter. I would really encourage you to kind of express and maybe just notice how these different areas of sexuality interact in your own life. It's not just about having the knowledge, but then taking that knowledge and having the awareness of it. Because often we can have the understanding, oh, yeah, I know this to be true, but am I actually being aware of how it plays into each other? Am I being aware of how my image of my body, whether I like it or not, whether I think that it is how I want it to be, um, all of these things, how does that play into the ways that I interact with people? Am I very aware of how those things play into each other? The way that my gender plays into how I interact with the other people. Maybe it's about the interactions with strangers that really plays into it. I would encourage you to pay attention because also as we have other discussions, as we really get into some conversations with friends and people on this podcast, this broader definition is going to be really, really important. So that's my thing for today. I hope it's really fun. A few notes before we go, though, because please stay. I know you might want to like just hop into the next thing, but stay with me for a moment. This is a new podcast. Join, like, just kind of adventuring on a new thing. So I would really appreciate just if you can listen, subscribe, give a review, especially a written review if you're listening on Apple or on Spotify or wherever, leave a comment and share it with someone who you think it might be helpful. But I also want to tell you guys about a few other things. If you are interested in hearing more about my work, the work of Holy Ourselves in general, you don't just have to hear about it here. There is Becoming Whole, the 7-episode miniseries I did earlier this year, which if you haven't listened to, you should go find it. Becoming Whole, 6 Spiritual Movements. But also every month I put out a Substack newsletter. Often there's news in there. I try to have that be like the first place that hears about news when possible. And so you'll hear about upcoming events I'm speaking at, those kinds of things. Sometimes I'll put in resource recommendations, maybe books I'm reading, podcasts I'm listening to, or other resources that I have been able to help create. So you'll be able to hear that. And then I'll normally do a writing on something around spiritual formation and sexuality. I'm really excited. I'm actually going to have some guest authors write some stuff for the newsletter. So be on the lookout. You can go to the website. There's also a link in the description here of this episode where you can go to the Substack. But if you go to holyourselves.org, there is a button there where you can subscribe to the Substack. And then also you can get more information and support all of this work by supporting on Patreon. As I said last episode, I'm going to be building it out. So right now there's a lot of tiers, but they only have the same one benefit, which is monthly episodes. And there's going to be more for the later tiers, but I'm really excited. I was trying to figure out what to talk about on the Patreon because I want the core of the podcast to still be the podcast, but I want to be able to give something maybe more in depth, maybe something I just really enjoy and I think you would enjoy. And with this kind of discussion about sexuality and how I was saying earlier, like once you get this, oh my gosh, the Bible just opens up so differently. I want to try where we go through each month one book of the Bible. And obviously, we're not going to be able to cover everything, but doing a sexuality reading of the Bible, because so often when we're engaging with sexuality in the Bible, it's all about, hey, is this action right or is this action wrong? And again, I'm not saying that's bad to do. It's important to do. We need to know how to live. But I think there's so much more about sexuality in the Bible than just evaluating actions morally. So this episode that is now out today, along with this episode that you're listening to now, goes into Genesis and especially the story of Judah and Tamar, which is a little bit of an interesting one to pick, but I highlight on a few things. So starting in Genesis, and we're going to go all the way through the Bible. Hopefully, we'll see. If people really don't like it, then we won't. But I have a feeling there's going to be some other nerds out there. So if you're interested, please go to patreon.com, our Patreon page, patreon.com/holyourselves, which is also in the show notes. And you can subscribe there to hear that episode. And then next, in 2 weeks from now, I'm really excited that we are going to be having my dear friend Leslie on, which if you've heard anything I've done, you've certainly heard Leslie. We're going to talk about all different kinds of things. I doubt we're going to be able to keep it under like at 30 minutes, but we'll try. Maybe we'll do 30 minutes for a regular episode and 30 minutes for a bonus episode. I don't know, or put out 2 episodes or whatever. We'll do something. But if you haven't heard Leslie, before, you need to listen to the next episode. There's nothing that does not come out of that person's mouth that is not just gold in everything. And now is also a spiritual director. So we're just going to have those spiritual director conversations. And then I didn't say this in the last episode, but I want to make sure to say it here. I want to thank the Transient friends for our theme song, which is called Leave It All Behind. Dear friends, thank you so much for letting me use it as the theme song. I hope you guys enjoy it, and go over to Spotify and give them a listen, or Apple Music, wherever you listen. But the Transient friends, please give them a listen and listen to Leave It All Behind, because it's a great song. And with that, I just want to thank you for joining me on Holy Ourselves today. May you go into this week remembering that you are seen and loved and invited to live from a place of wholeness. Until next time, keep becoming.